When you think about possible isolated countries, you think about countries like Russia or other very boarded up countries, but there are simply more isolated countries out there. Quite possibly the most excluded and isolated part of the world also has its own different industries, as well as a car industry. In this video we're going to be talking about the North Korean car industry. In my opinion, the most unknown automotive industry in the world, which has some very unique parts. Join this journey with me as I try to dig up as many interesting facts about the North Korean car industry and find out and talk about every single passenger car it made so far. And trust me, it wasn't that easy to find all this, with North Korea not really being connected to the internet or even with the world in the first place. During this process, over 35 hours was spent surfing the internet, with more than 50 different web pages being read, summarized and connected to each other. I've placed all the links I've used of websites and sources in the description, but I want to thank ChineseCars.net a little bit extra for making this video possible, because without this website it would have been simply impossible to find over half of the information I've gathered for these videos. North Korea isn't a very common settled country, as it basically is just like the Soviet Union was in the 1930s and early 1960s, as car ownership is typically limited to government officials, military leaders and well-connected individuals only. Cars can't be owned privately, as only 30,000 cars are in North Korea for the 24 million inhabitants it has. To simply understand the situation that shaped North Korea, it is safe to say that Korea was claimed and divided by two major forces in 1948. It was a result of the Soviet Union claiming North Korea and the US claiming South Korea, to which eventually the great-grandfather of Kim Jong-un was made the leader of the country in the late 1940s, early 1950s. This simply caused the Soviet Union to have a great impact on the industry within North Korea and also caused the so-called self-reliance of the country since 1948, and it basically still remains this way up until this day. There are some important brands like Mercedes-Benzes and Toyotas, of which even Kim Jong-un has a very good amount of Mercedes-Benzes. All of these imported foreign cars are for the higher class people, which most of the time are seen in Pyongyang, but these remain very rare. The car industry had been mostly shut off of the world with a low production, little development each year and unique brands. Or are they? Basically, every common car seen in North Korea is produced in North Korea itself, either being heavily influenced by other cars or even being built by these car brands, simply being shipped to North Korea, but with more North Korean-like names, like Rebadge for example. As far as I could find, there are a few important car production plants, the most important one being the Sungri Motor Plant, which helped with the origin story of the North Korean car industry, with another important and quite recent one being the Pyeonghwa Motors, established in 1998 as a collaboration between South Korea and North Korea. This mostly produces kits and is delivered by Europe and China. And you also had Pyeongsang Auto Works, but much less is known about this manufacturer. Although there are many North Korean car models out there, due to the scarcity of materials, it is estimated that, even though the most important manufacturer has a reported maximum output of 10,000 units a year, only produces 1,000 up to 3,000 car models a year, with Pyeonghwa Motors also only producing less than 2,000 passenger car units a year, which is insanely low, knowing that North Korea has a population of around 24 to 26 million people. The Wikipedia page on the subject suggests that North Korea has the capability to produce 40 to 50,000 vehicles a year, although the average of over some years has only been a few thousand, even as low as a few hundred, due to some economic crisis and sanctions. For North Korea, some of their largest spendings go into the military, so it is no surprise that some of the biggest automotive production that takes place in the country is consigned to light and heavy-duty truck manufacturing. It somewhat simply is a country that fails to innovate up until this day. The North Korean automotive industry traces its origins to 1950s, 1958 to be precise, shortly after the Korean War ended, influenced heavily by Soviet and Chinese vehicles. Early efforts focused on reproducing Soviet models like the Gas M20 Pobeda, built locally under the name GEC No. 1 at the Seungri Motor Plant. This factory, established in 1950, remains one of North Korea's key automotive facilities. These factories were and are still owned by the government. The Seungri Motor Plant played a central role in North Korea's automotive development, located in Tokchang. It initially produced trucks and expanded to include passenger cars like the Kangsang 88, which was basically a clone of the Mercedes-Benz W201 190e. These vehicles were tailored for the state and used for the elite, emphasizing basic functionality over luxury. Besides these concept cars and Russian imports vehicles, North Korea, in my opinion, always tries to avoid as many interactions between its citizens and foreign products, which you can see very clearly on the way it produces cars and rebadges them. Vehicle production wasn't a big thing, and still isn't, and while the truck production began in the 1950s, with the first traces of vehicles made in North Korea go back a decade later, in 1961 to be precise, when the Seungri Motor Plant made a concept car called the Seungri 4.15, a clone of the GAZ 69. It never made it to production whatsoever, and afterwards the Seungri Motor Plant tried a few more passenger cars, for example the Achimkoi, which basically was a GAZ M20 Pobeda clone yet again. Because of this, I guess you could say there are three major vehicle production companies in North Korea since the 1950s, which basically importing wise was GAZ and the North Korea Seungri Motor Plant and later established Pyeonghwa Motors. Each company was somewhat active in different decades. For example, the Seungri Motor Plant was really active for the beginning phase, somewhat in collaboration with GAZ, even though these models never made it to full production. GAZ basically was more active in the same period, for example the 1950s, up until I guess around the 1980s when the Soviet Union collapsed, mostly with North Korea importing GAZ cars into the country. And in the 1970s there was actually a notorious big import of 1000 Volvo 144s in 1973. However, North Korea still hasn't paid for this import, and you could still see some of these cars made on the road, which is just insane to think about as these cars are 51 years old at this point. After the mid-1980s, when GAZ wasn't importing that much into North Korea, and when tensions were high between East and the West because of the Cold War, I guess you could say there was a break of around 10 years, with some exceptions for some concept cars made here and there, but no real production of passenger vehicles. That all changed up until the establishment of Pyeonghwa Motor Corporation in 1998, as this was the first car company to focus on the production of passenger cars. Production-wise, it was a very interesting country. According to some defectors, North Korea car makers often use a procedure called anatomy plan drawing, which quite literally deals with drawing up automotive design by importing a foreign car and disassembling the vehicle piece by piece to sketch the design of the car and to copy it. So basically, here is a quick summary of all the brands that are active in North Korea. GAZ mostly was active from the early 1950s to mid 1980s and was a Russian car manufacturer, and this was an important manufacturer because of the Soviet Union's influences on North Korea. The one model from the brand that is widely seen in the country is the Volga, and these were built from 1956 to 2010, with the GAZ 24 Volga being produced between 1917 and 1985 models being the most common. The influences of GAZ mostly were active between the 1950s and 1980s, and actually mostly collaborated with the Seungri Motor Plant as well. The Seungri Motor Plant was North Korea's own vehicle manufacturer and was active between 1950 and to this day, but the production for trucks and vehicles on itself started in 1958. Basically, this is the first North Korean production plant, although Seungri Motors is mostly into manufacturing heavy-duty SUVs, construction and heavy cargo trucks. They produce many different models and have only produced a handful of passenger vehicles. For example, the Seungri 4.15, which was based on the GAZ 69 with a 4-cylinder engine, although this probably was only a concept. And you also had the Achimkoi, which was a GAZ M20 Pobeda clone. Seungri basically made many models on the GAZ 69, mostly all positioned towards the military. You also had the Pyongyang 4.10, then the Kangsang 88, which basically both were Mercedes W201 clones made in 1988 for the Pyeongchang 4.10 and around 1993 for the Kangsang 88. There was an exhibition in 1978 eventually showing a car called the Seungri, as in the Seungri motor plant, Ppeokkugi. However, very little is known about this car, as I couldn't find any specs about this car, only that it was most likely produced in 1978. On this photo you could really see the few models of the GAZ 69, which basically was a rebadged to, in this case, the Seungri motor plant. And you can see on the left that it produced some trucks as well, with the Ppeokkugi being the most ride vehicle. Besides the Seungri motor plant, you also have Pyeonghwa Motors, which was active between 1998 up until now, or was unofficially active since 1994, producing some kits at that point. This company focuses mostly on passenger cars and some buses too. It is the only licensed car manufacturer of passenger vehicles in North Korea, somewhat making the company a monopoly in its segment. It was created as a sign of peace between North and South Korea, with Pyeonghwa meaning peace in Korean. The setup of the company cost around $75 million in 1998. And this has been the main production line of passenger vehicles for North Korea market ever since its establishment in 1998. Although the company somewhat was already active, as I said before, since 1994, producing cars from some kits it had delivered to it. As far as I could find, there were plans for a factory with a total of 11 halls. However, that was actually never made and there probably only is a single hall for the factory currently. As we're focusing on passenger vehicles, as that's what my whole channel basically is about, nothing like trucks, we're going to be focusing on this particular brand, Pyeonghwa Motors. Pyeonghwa Motors, established in 1998 or 1994, assembled vehicles from various Chinese and European kits, with the only known European kit being the Hwiparam 1, which basically was made between 2002 and 2006, which basically was a Fiat Sierra or Palio, and the Ppeokkugi 1, which was a Fiat Doblò probably made between 2003 and 2004. Pyeonghwa Motors after 2005 mostly sells cars either as a rebadged Chinese car or by Chinese brands like Shuguang, later known as Huanghai, or various rebadges by Volkswagen China models. This was because of the collaboration license ending between Fiat and other manufacturers, and the Fiats were too expensive to produce. These cars produced after 2005 are pretty much rip-offs too though. China copies European, Japanese and American cars, and North Korea copies from those Chinese copies again, simply renaming them, which it might look like a Volkswagen Jetta from 10 meters away, but really looks weird from up close. The Hwiparam 1 was based on the Fiat Siena or Palio and was produced between 2002 and 2006, and basically the whole company started with this car. These were powered by a 1.6 liter diesel or a 1.2 liter engine, and the engine outputs were between 93 and 121 horsepower, although I quite likely doubt this power output, as this is quite high in my opinion. They were made for an estimated 500 times. This model basically is one of the best known models from North Korea, and it is quite notorious, as you can still see some of these cars on the streets. The Ppeokkugi 1 was a minivan based on the Fiat Doblò, and it was the second model to be produced by Pyeonghwa Motors. However, this model was a much smaller success. It is estimated that this model was made between 2003 and 2004, also being produced in way smaller numbers than the 500 of the Hwiparam 1. It was the last car made under Fiat license, and after this model, the Chinese models entered the market under the Pyeonghwa name. While producing these two sorts of Italian Fiat models, which basically were too expensive to make, the owner of Pyeonghwa Motors, Mooney Church, got in touch with a few Chinese car manufacturers, one of which was the Chinese company called Shuangwang, which was later renamed to Huanghai. The advantage of these manufacturers was that the export to Vietnam was possible, where they were also sold by the Mekong Company, another connection Mooney Church had. 2004 was an important year for the brand. During this year it still produced the Fiat replicas, although thanks to the connections the owner of the company had with Chinese car manufacturers, It was possible for the company to create new models and slowly let loose of the way too expensive to produce Fiat replicas. These models succeeded the Ppeokkugi 1, which wasn't a success on its own. This model simply was called the Ppeokkugi 2, or Premio 4x2, possible as well in North Korea. It was in my opinion a gigantic SUV with a length of 5.1 meters, being nothing like the cars made before by Pyeonghwa. It was produced between 2004 and 2006, and it was a car based on Hwanghai Shuagwang, which is basically a copy of the Isuzu Altera, and is powered by a 2.2 liter inline-4 diesel with 120 horsepower, although this could also be a gasoline or a petrol engine, but I simply couldn't find it anywhere. Despite its huge size, it only had a weight of just over 1400 kilograms, and the top speed wasn't great either, rated at only 135 kilometers an hour. Kind of strange in my opinion. The SUV was a great increase in the lineup of what Pyeonghwa wanted to offer in North Korea, and even offered some models in Vietnam. The same year, in 2004, the brand immediately expanded even more, with a pickup version of the Ppeokkugi 2. It's simply being called the Ppeokkugi 3, or Premio PU, with PU standing for pickup. It had the same engine, although I also found a diesel sport version with the 2.8 liter diesel with 89 horsepower, and that is why I think that this could also be a 2.2 liter inline-4 petrol with 120 horsepower, although I sadly couldn't find any more information about these engines. The Ppeokkugi 3 or Premio PU was produced between 2004 and 2009 or 2013, as it wasn't sure. The car is also based on the Hwanghai Shuagwang. Despite these models being based on the Hwanghai Shuagwang, I also found out that there was basically another company which actually just produces these vehicles called Dadi Auto, and it basically is a Chinese brand which was defunct in 2012. And the pickup version basically was called the Dadi Smoothing, which was produced between 2006 and 2012 and was a pickup based on the Isuzu Rodeo, or it could be a Dadi Unisonus, which was produced between 2007 and 2012. However, the SUV version could be the Dadi Dushinjungma, which basically was a one-on-one replica of this exact model, and that's why I think that this car is actually this exact model. The Ppeokkugi 3 or Premio PU, which is a copy of the Isuzu Altera and is powered by the same engine with the same specifications, although being a bit shorter than the two, rated at 5.03 meters. This was the start of Pyeonghwa Motors, and in the next video we'll be going deeper into these Chinese models that Pyeonghwa introduced after 2005 and what the company did since that point. I hope you've enjoyed this series so far. If you did, please let me know by dropping a like and commenting under this video what you thought about it, and checking out this playlist and subscribing for more, and I will see you in the next video.